Margaret Wilkins hummed softly to herself as she carefully arranged the bowl of candy by her front door. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she adjusted each piece, creating a perfect display of butterscotch discs, colourful lollipops and chocolate bars. "There," she murmured, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. Halloween had always been her favourite holiday, a night when the sleepy neighbourhood came alive with excitement. Even at 75, Margaret felt a childlike thrill as October 31st approached. She shuffled to the hall mirror, smoothing down her silver hair and straightening her festive orange sweater. The mirror's surface was slightly cloudy, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw something odd in her reflection. A shimmer, perhaps, or a faint glow around her edges, but she blinked and everything looked normal again. "Oh, Margaret, your eyes are playing tricks on you," she chuckled nervously. The house creaked around her, a symphony of old wood and memories. Margaret had lived in this Victorian-style home at the end of Maple Street for over 50 years. Now, with her husband gone and the children grown, the house felt too big, too quiet. But on Halloween it came alive again, filled with the echoes of laughter and excited feet on the porch. As she worked, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed dustier than usual despite her regular cleaning. A fine layer of undisturbed dust coated the mantelpiece and family photos. In the kitchen, she noticed cobwebs in corners she was sure she'd cleaned just yesterday. "I must be slipping in my old age," Margaret muttered, reaching for a duster. But as she turned, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She steadied herself against the counter, blinking rapidly as the room seemed to shimmer and shift around her. For a split second she saw the kitchen as if left untended for months, dusty, dim, abandoned. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision faded. Margaret pressed a hand to her forehead, feeling suddenly tired. "Perhaps I've been overdoing it," she said to the empty room. "A cup of tea, that's what I need." As she waited for the kettle to boil, she glanced at the calendar hanging by the refrigerator. For a moment she frowned, certain that the date was wrong. Hadn't she flipped the page to November last week? But no. There it was, clearly showing October 31st. The kettle's whistle jolted her from her thoughts. Margaret shook her head, chuckling at her own confusion. "Of course it's October 31st, she said aloud. "It's Halloween, silly old woman." Cup of tea in hand, Margaret settled into her favourite armchair by the front window. From here she had a perfect view of the street, where the first trick-or-treaters were starting to appear. She smiled as she watched a group of children in bright costumes make their way down the sidewalk, plastic pumpkins and pillowcases swinging from their hands. The doorbell chimed, and Margaret set down her tea with a delighted, "Oh, they're here!" She hurried to the door, scooping up the candy bowl on her way. With a warm smile, she opened the door wide. "Happy Halloween!" she exclaimed. On her porch stood 3 children, a princess, a superhero, and a little ghost. But instead of the cheerful trick-or-treat Margaret expected, she was met with wide-eyed stares and open mouths. The princess screamed first, a shrill sound that made Margaret jump. The superhero stumbled backward, nearly falling off the porch steps. Even the little ghost, peering through the eye-holes of a bedsheet, seemed frozen in terror. "Goodness!" Margaret exclaimed, taken aback by their reaction. "What's the matter, dears?" "It's only me, Mrs. Wilkins. Would you like some candy?" But the children were already running, their screams fading as they raced down the street. Margaret stood in the doorway, the candy bowl hanging limply from her hand, utterly baffled by what had just happened. "Well, I never," she murmured, closing the door slowly. She caught a glimpse of herself in the hall mirror and paused. For a moment, just the briefest flash, she thought she saw something strange. A paleness to her skin, perhaps, or a faint glow around her edges. But when she looked directly at her reflection, everything seemed normal. Margaret shook her head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. They were just playing a Halloween prank, she told herself firmly. The next group will be calmer. But as the evening wore on, each group of trick-or-treaters reacted with increasing hostility. Children who had happily visited her house for years now ran screaming from her porch, some even throwing eggs or toilet paper at her house as they fled. "Get away, you old witch!" one boy yelled, his face contorted with fear and anger. "This house is haunted!" another shouted, pointing at Margaret with a trembling finger. With each encounter, Margaret grew more distressed and confused. She couldn't understand what was happening. Was her Halloween decoration too scary this year? Had someone been spreading rumours about her house? As the night deepened, fewer children ventured up her walk. Those who did seemed to be daring each other, their faces a mix of fear and cruel excitement. "I bet you can't touch the door," one girl challenged her friend. "I heard if you look in the window, you'll see a ghost," another whispered loudly. Margaret's heart sank with each cruel comment and frightened scream. The joy she usually felt on Halloween had been replaced by a deep, aching sadness and a growing sense of bitterness. "Why are they being so cruel?" she whispered to the empty room. "What have I done to deserve this?" With trembling hands, she turned off the porch light and locked the door. She couldn't bear any more cruelty tonight. As she moved through the house, turning off lights and blowing out candles, she felt a heaviness settling over her. In the kitchen she paused, her hand hovering over the light switch. For a moment she saw the room as it had appeared in her earlier vision, dusty, neglected, abandoned. She blinked hard and the illusion vanished, but the unease remained. Back in the living room, Margaret sank into her armchair. She felt exhausted, drained in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. As she gazed out at the quiet street, a deep melancholy settled over her, tinged with a bitterness she had never felt before. "Oh, George," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I miss you. I miss the way Halloween used to be. What's happened to our little neighbourhood? When did the children become so cruel?" The house seemed to sigh around her, the familiar creaks and settling noises almost a response to her words. Margaret's eyelids grew heavy, and she felt herself drifting off. As sleep began to claim her, the room around her seemed to shimmer and fade. In those last moments before unconsciousness took her, Margaret had a fleeting thought, a memory of last Halloween night, of feeling suddenly, terribly ill, of calling for help, her voice echoing in the empty house, of a crushing pain in her chest, the world going dark around her. But before she could grasp the significance of this memory, sleep claimed her. Margaret's form settled deeper into the armchair, growing still and silent. The house stood silent and dark, a stark contrast to the festive decorations that adorned its porch. Inside, Margaret Wilkins stirred in her armchair, her eyes fluttering open. The room was bathed in the soft golden light of early morning, and for a moment she felt disoriented. "Oh my," she murmured, sitting up straighter. "Did I fall asleep? What time is it?" She glanced at the clock on the mantel, but its hands seemed frozen at 11:55 p.m. Margaret frowned, a vague sense of unease settling over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As she stood, her joints creaking in protest, Margaret noticed the bowl of candy by the door. It was still full, untouched by trick-or-treaters. The events of the previous night came flooding back. The frightened children, the cruel taunts, the growing sense of isolation. "What a dreadful Halloween," she sighed, moving to the window. The street outside was quiet, with no sign of the previous night's festivities. Fallen leaves skittered across the pavement, driven by a chill autumn breeze. Margaret was about to turn away when a movement caught her eye. A small figure was making its way up her walkway, a child in a Halloween costume. Margaret's heart leapt. Perhaps this young one had missed out on trick-or-treating last night and was hoping for some belated candy. Without hesitation, Margaret hurried to the door, pausing only to smooth her hair and straighten her sweater. She picked up the candy bowl and opened the door with a warm smile. "Well, hello there," she called out cheerfully. "You're a bit late for Halloween, but I still have plenty of treats." The child on her porch was small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed in an old-fashioned costume that looked like something out of a Victorian storybook. A porcelain mask obscured the child's face, its painted features frozen in a serene smile. "Trick or treat," the child said softly, holding out an antique pillowcase. Margaret's smile faltered slightly. There was something odd about the child's voice. It seemed to echo slightly as if coming from far away. But she quickly dismissed the thought, chalking it up to her overactive imagination after a stressful night. "My, what a lovely costume," Margaret said, dropping a handful of candy into the pillowcase. "Are your parents nearby?" The child shook its head slowly. "I came alone. May I come in? It's rather cold out here." Margaret hesitated. She had always been taught never to invite strangers into her home, but this was just a child. And it was chilly outside. "Well, I suppose you could come in for a moment to warm up," she said, stepping aside. "Would you like some hot cocoa?" The child nodded and entered, their movements oddly fluid and graceful. Margaret closed the door and led the way to the kitchen, unaware of the faint shimmer that seemed to follow in the child's wake. As Margaret busied herself making cocoa, she chatted amiably, trying to put her young guest at ease. "You know, I had quite a fright last night. All the children seemed terribly scared of me. I can't imagine why. Do you think my decorations were too spooky?" The child, perched on a kitchen chair, remained silent. Margaret turned, a steaming mug in her hand, and froze. The kitchen around her seemed to flicker, momentarily transforming into the dusty, abandoned room she had glimpsed before. The child sat motionless, the mask's painted smile now seeming more eerie than cheerful. Margaret blinked hard, and the vision faded. She set the mug down with a shaky hand. "Here you are, dear. Careful, it's hot." The child made no move to take the cocoa. Instead they spoke, their voice taking on a strange, echoing quality. "Margaret, do you know why you're here?" A chill ran down Margaret's spine. I live here. This is my home." The child tilted their head slightly. "Is it? Think carefully, Margaret. What do you remember about last night, about last year?" Margaret's mind raced. Fragments of memories flashed through her mind. The calendar showing last year's date, the dust-covered rooms, the terror in the children's eyes, and then, more distant but growing clearer, a searing pain in her chest, the world going dark, waking up alone in an empty house. "No," she whispered, stumbling backward. "No, it can't be. I can't be." The child stood, its form seeming to grow taller, more imposing. "You've been here for a year, Margaret. Trapped between worlds, unable to move on. It's time to remember. It's time to let go." Margaret's back hit the wall, and she slid down, her legs no longer able to support her. The room around her flickered and shifted, revealing its true state, dusty, abandoned, frozen in time. She looked down at her hands and saw them shimmer and fade, becoming translucent. "I'm dead?" The words felt strange in her mouth, foreign and terrifying. The child nodded, reaching up to remove its mask. Margaret gasped as she saw not the face of a child, but a swirling vortex of light and shadow. "I am a guide, Margaret. I've come to help you cross over. But first you must accept what has happened." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. Memories flooded back. Her collapse on Halloween night a year ago, the frantic call for help that went unanswered, the terrifying moments as her life slipped away. "But why?" she sobbed. "Why was I trapped here? Why couldn't I see?" The guide's voice was gentle. "Your love for this place, for Halloween, for the joy you brought to children. It tethered you here. Your spirit wasn't ready to leave, but in doing so, You became a source of fear for the living. The veil between worlds is thin on Halloween, Margaret. The children could sense your presence, even if they couldn't fully see you. Margaret's mind reeled. All those frightened faces, the cruel words, they weren't acts of malice, but expressions of terror at encountering something beyond their understanding. She had become the very thing she never wanted to be, a frightening presence in a place she had always filled with warmth and love. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The guide extended a hand. "Now you have a choice. You can stay here, trapped between worlds, or you can come with me. I can show you the way to what lies beyond." Margaret looked around the kitchen, seeing it clearly for the first time in a year. The dust, the decay, the emptiness. This was no longer her home. It was a shell, a memory of what once was. Will it hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. The guide shook its head. "No, Margaret. Crossing over is like waking from a long dream. It's a release, a return to your true self." Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself. She thought of George, of all the loved ones who had gone before her. Were they waiting? The thought filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly she reached out and took the guide's hand. As their fingers touched, a soft light began to emanate from the point of contact, spreading up Margaret's arm and throughout her body. "That's it," the guide said encouragingly. "Let go of your fears, your regrets. Remember the joy you brought to this place, the love you shared. Carry that with you." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling lighter with each passing moment. The weight of her earthly concerns, the lingering attachment to her home and her routines, all of it began to fall away. In its place, a sense of peace and anticipation grew. When she opened her eyes again, the kitchen had faded away. She and the guide stood in a space filled with warm golden light. In the distance, Margaret could see indistinct figures waiting, their arms outstretched in welcome. "Are you ready?" the guide asked. Margaret nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Yes, I think I am." Hand in hand, they stepped forward into the light. As they did, the last vestiges of Margaret's earthly form faded away, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of a presence in the old house at the end of Maple Street. In the days that followed, a young couple walked by, pushing a stroller. They paused, looking up at the Victorian house with its faded Halloween decorations. "You know," the woman said, "I always loved this house as a kid. The old lady who lived here gave out the best candy on Halloween." Her husband nodded. "I heard she was found in her chair, like she just fell asleep. Sad that no one noticed for so long." As they spoke, a warm breeze rustled the leaves on the lawn, carrying with it the faintest scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. For just a moment the couple could have sworn they heard the echo of a kind elderly voice saying, "Happy Halloween, dears." They shared a puzzled look, then continued on their way. Behind them the old house stood silent, its windows dark. But there was a sense of peace about the place now, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. And though no one would ever know it, Margaret Wilkins had finally found her way home, leaving behind a legacy of love, kindness, and the enduring magic of Halloween.